All right, everybody, you should have your paper for tonight that says last week's date on it. Big thanks to Greg for jumping in for me last week. I literally bought a plane ticket at 10 a.m. and was on a plane by 7 p.m., which some of us experienced that more than others, right, Eric? So if you want a paper for tonight, we're on 3:30 is the date at the top of the paper that we're going to talk about tonight.
Anybody need that?
Anybody need one? Anybody want one?
Yes.
Well, tonight we're going to continue to talk about human authorities and authority given by God. It's a conversation we started 2 weeks ago, and it's an important topic to talk about. I think this is a really, really important topic to talk about these days and the days that we all live in. If you look there on your paper, there's two particular passages that I want to talk through tonight. Let's read these first, and then I'll give you guys a chance to do a little discussion, and then we'll talk about some things here. So this is 1 Peter 2. It says 13 through 25, but it's actually just the first part here. Okay. So this is Peter writing, and he says, "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor." So that's Peter's words about this topic. Now listen to Paul in Romans 13. He says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed." Now these are two really good passages to have side by side, because you hear a lot of similarities, which we're going to talk about tonight. All right, here's your discussion. You have like 2 minutes for this, okay? Very quick. Here's your discussion. In verse 13 of 1 Peter chapter 2, he says, "Be subject to the Lord's sake to every human institution." As quickly as you can, put together a list of things that fall into that category.
Human institution.
Human institution. In this context. Ready, set, go. What do you mean? You guys never wait for me anyway.
Some people can, and others cannot.
One minute.
But anything,
Would you come up? What?
Ask us first.
Okay. Is that safe?
Ask us first, and we can say the same thing.
All right, 10 seconds. That's a good one. That's a good one. That's true. All right. All right, Ellie, you want to go first? Grandpa says ask Ellie, so.
Sure.
Okay.
Now, apart from saying
All right, you got to speak up so everybody can hear you.
sorry. Apart from saying everything,
Okay,
we came up with four main groups.
Go.
Which would be family, government, church, and business.
very good. Very good categories. And let me just point out that if you read 1 Peter 2 into 1 Peter 3, three of those four categories are right there in 1 Peter. The only one that's not is the church, which we see defined in other places. So, very good answer. Did you come up with that on your own? You had help at your table?
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right, these two wanted to go first, but I didn't let them.
Church,
Church,
federal government,
okay,
state and local government,
okay,
county government.
that's true. That's true. What? Phil wanted to go last so he could just say what everybody else said.
Works for me.
Ladies, what'd you guys come up with? Anything different than that?
I don't think so.
Nothing?
No, pretty much everything.
Pretty much the same thing? Okay. How about you guys?
We copied all
You copied Ellie, really? I didn't see you get up.
some subcategories, topics.
What'd you say with that again?
Some subcategories,
Give us one.
state government.
State government.
Yeah.
It's okay. Yeah, good.
The same.
This is like a date, you guys.
Exciting. Just being.
I was more closer to offended than flattered, but okay. I picked up on the sarcasm pretty quick.
I think that's next week's topic. Build a church that's pleasant.
Anything different than anybody
You
else?
know, one thing it's just kind of, it's the day we're in, but any place you go, if you don't, it seems like if you don't follow their rules, they could call the cops on you.
Okay.
So, everybody has their own authorities, really, their own rules.
All right, very good point, Mark. And this is something that we need to talk about. This is why I wanted to do this, because I thought we would actually get more varied answers than we got. But let me see if I can paraphrase what you're saying. Everywhere and every place has a structure of authority, right? And as members of the world, right, and as believers, we enter into and interact with those structures of authority everywhere we go. And we should say, I'm talking about just a second, that's actually a good thing. Right? It's a good thing. When Peter says, I know you guys want to give you guys a chance to answer, be subject to the Lord's sake to every human institution. There's an indication here that there are institutions of authority in every facet of society. He gives some examples, which we've all given some, but we should recognize they're everywhere. Everywhere. In every facet of life. All right, you guys have anything different? Something to add?
Basically the same, although we had government times 1,000.
Because why?
Just there's so many layers.
Yeah,
And-
okay.
And there's so many, there's courts and there's executive and then there's
So there's branches of government and then there's layers of government on top of that.
layers, that's what it is.
Yeah.
Layers. And then we just wrote down at the end, anything with authority. So
Okay.
it's
Kind of what Mark is saying, what we're talking about, right? I think this,
I wrote down order, but it could be order or disorder.
well, that's true. We need to talk about that a little bit actually tonight. But order and structure of authority go together hand in hand. And we should, I think we should be clear about that. Order and authority within things are two pieces, they're two sides of the exact same coin. Authority and rules, right? All of that creates order in a society and it creates an order in any entity of society. It's a good thing. And it's very, very important because if you guys remember 2 weeks ago when we started talking about this, one of the things that I pointed out is that it is an inherent within us as part of our sin nature to rebel against authority in our lives. That's just a natural inclination that we have of ourselves. So I want you to just think about this for a moment before we really look at this. The natural inclination of our hearts is to rebel against authority, yet there is authority in every single facet of life. Now you start to see sort of the tension that we live in. And I want to come back to that tension at the end here, okay? All right, let's talk about what's on the paper here because I want to talk about this whole idea of government and our world and some of the things that we see going on. That's really our topic for tonight, even though it all sort of fits into this idea of human institutions and human authority. All right, I just wrote down some things to think about here as we start. You can write these down if you want. You can interact with them if you want. You can argue with me if you want. That's fine. Generally speaking, we should say government is necessary for human flourishing. And by human flourishing, I mean to have order and function or lack of chaos and lack of disorder. Governments are necessary. Governments are a necessary thing. Can we also say, I mean, you see it right here in the text, but can we also say the concept of government is a good thing? Good as defined by God? We should say that too, right? And we all sort of think that way. But generally speaking, can we also say there's a lack of trust in human governments? No laughing. That's an understatement. Okay, but here's what I want you to think about, Phil, and for all of us to think about when it comes to this one. I think, okay? Whatever the degree of lack of trust that there is today in 2022, I suspect that lack of trust might have been significantly less a generation ago. True? Yeah. And a generation before that, even less. Meaning there would have been more trust in civil, local, state, federal governments than there is today. There have been more trust, and the further you go back, at least in American history, there would have been more trust in the governments than now. So, while I understand that it is sort of funny, like to say there's a lack of trust is a gross understatement, also you have to recognize that, that's a relative thing to a particular time that you live in, right? Now, go back to the year 1750, let's say, before the founding of America, and even really before the Puritans make their way over here, okay, the separationists. Huge distrust in government. That's how they ended up here. Right? They're over in Europe, and they're like, we can't even survive with our religious convictions on this continent. We got to go to a whole new continent to make this work. So you see what I'm saying? Like there's waxing and wanings of degree of lack of trust in human governments, sort of depending on where you find yourself in human history. It's an important part because I think probably we would say there's always that sort of idea of lack of trust, and I want to explain why here in just a second. But it varies at different times. Right now, we probably all say high degree of a lack of trust in our government. True? Okay. All right, now I'm really going to hit a nerve. Ready? I think governments, especially federal governments, are an idol for many people. Here's why. We have relied on something like religious freedom in this country and assumed that the gospel would go forth simply because we have religious freedom. And so oftentimes we fight for religious freedom rather than actually advancing the cause of the gospel on our own. We assume that religious freedom under the government will do the work that the church is given to do. Okay? We assume that the government will provide us protections and freedoms, which it should do. And so the government becomes a thing that we fight for rather than the actual freedoms or the actual moral living that we should fight for itself. Okay? Last one, just a general concept to think about. Governments generally, this has gone up and down through human history, are viewed as a great power on earth. There's great power in government. We're gonna talk about some of the Roman emperors in just a little bit later. I don't know if you know this, but even in the first century, the Roman emperors were killing one another in order to become emperor. Well, why? Because there's great power to be had at the highest seat of government. And so governments of the earth generally are viewed as having great power over the people. All right. Having said all that, I wanted to throw some of those generalizations out, because then what I want to do is I want to look at our text here, and I want to come up with some ways to define what a government is, biblically speaking. Now, I have 8 things that I wrote down from this text, and I want you to recognize point number 1 on your outline is what the text says. Point number 2, then, we'll go back through and then do some comparisons to what we actually see today. All right? So when I give you one of these in this first list, don't say, well, I know. I get it, all right? I know it's not like that. All right? That's not the point. All right? What I want you to see is how God defines government. Why are you laughing? All right? I already knew this was going to go, right? Especially with the first couple of these, okay? All right, first one. Romans 13, verse 1. There is no authority except from God. Okay? There is no authority except from God. Now, there's 2 things you can sort of extrapolate from that idea. One, every government is given its authority to rule and to exercise power from God, but there's also an inference made in that the ultimate power belongs to God himself. God gives away that which he has ultimately. Right? It's not stated there, but that's the point Paul's trying to make. There's no authority except from God. God has the authority, and he grants it to the human governments. All right? Point 2. Every government that exists has been instituted by God. That's at the end of verse 1. Romans 13, verse 1. Every government is instituted by God himself. Next one. 1 Peter 2, verse 14. Governments are for punishing those who do evil. Point number 4, into that one. Praise or reward for those who do good. Now I know, I get it. I already see the looks around the room. We're going to talk about it in a second, okay? But do you understand that is what government is given for? And I just want you to think about this for a second. We're going to look at these other ones, but I want you to think about this for a second. That is what creates order and eliminates chaos. Rewarding good, punishing evil. Now just think about this from a very, very simplistic standpoint, all right? Think about going to Walmart, my favorite place. Okay? I didn't expect the pushback on that. Okay. At Walmart, if you obey the rules, right? You obey the rules that Walmart has set in place and also that the government has set in place, you are given the opportunity to purchase whatever you want, assuming you have money for it. Or you have a checkbook and you don't have any money, but you can still write a check. That's a joke some of you didn't get. Okay. However, if you break the rules, you're no longer afforded that privilege. Right? And if you break the rules in a severe way, you're probably going to go to jail. Or not unless you live in California, in which you could steal up to $900 and not get punished for it. Is that something like that? You know about that?
I've heard that.
You haven't heard that?
I have heard that.
Yeah. It's something like $900.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's insane. Okay?
Per day?
Maybe per event, I don't know. Like, go load up your car and go back in. I'm not sure. What is it?
It is per event, yes.
Literally.
You can go out and do it tomorrow, same thing.
Go in the morning and go in the afternoon.
Do you have to pay taxes on that? I'm sure they are.
I'm sure they're paying taxes. Yes, Tom.
I have to tell you the Walmart story then.
Okay, all right. Here comes. I'm going to be sorry I brought Walmart up, but go ahead.
We recently went to Arizona.
Yes.
And on the way I realized I didn't bring any socks along.
Okay.
So I had to go to Walmart. We
Which-
stopped at a Walmart to buy socks.
Yeah, which is a common occurrence.
Common occurrence.
Yes.
I didn't think it was a big deal. I walk in there and I go to find the socks and I find them and they're locked up behind glass. We had to go find a person to come unlock the cabinet and hand us the socks.
No, she didn't hand us the sign.
No, she didn't hand us the socks. She had to follow us to the register.
Are you kidding me?
I am not kidding you. She followed us to the register, gave them to the person, and then we could buy them. And so Brenda asked her, well, what's the big deal with these socks? There's so many homeless people that come in here that need socks, they just walk out with them.
No kidding.
And we can't keep them on the shelf. And so we now have them locked up.
And all the socks on the racks were all empty.
Is that right?
None
If it was
there,
open, yeah.
if it was open, yeah. Wow.
Oh, like you leave the wrappers or the.
No, saying the ones that weren't unlocked, or the ones that weren't locked up had been stolen, and the ones that were locked up were still there.
You were after the expensive socks.
Yeah.
Heinz, Hanes, whatever.
How did you leave home without socks on?
Okay, so great example of the point I'm trying to make. No, it's fine. This is good. Plus, we're telling Walmart stories, which is my favorite thing. So, Walmart just above Menard stories, right? Point being, if you follow the rules, Walmart rewards that which is good and punishes that which is evil. At least that's the idea. That's the design. Okay?
Did you get rewarded?
Did I?
Yeah, like,
At Menards? What? For socks? Tom, you mean?
No, you at Walmart.
Then we got our socks.
Usually, no. The answer is no, because I usually spend more money than I should at Walmart.
You got to buy a lot of things at a cheap price.
Correct. Same way at Menards. Right? All right, next one. Verse 3 of Romans 13. Rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but they should be a terror to bad conduct. Now, I want you to make sure you understand something about Romans 13 here. Mixed in together are both commands for us as believers on how to understand governments, but there's also some things in here. Paul is simply just making statements. This is how governments are to be. He's not saying this is how they are. He's saying this is how they are to be. And that's an important distinction to make, especially when it comes to within what he says we are to do about these things. Okay? So rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but they are a terror to bad conduct, or at least they should be. Okay? Verse 4. This is going to get really hard. For he is God's servant for your good. Now, he, in this case, emperor. But for us, we could insert there, the government is God's servant for your good. Keep going in verse 4. The government bears the sword. See that? Gets worse. Into verse 4. For he, the government, is a servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Don't look at me like that. I know. I understand the difficulty with this, but this is why it's so important to look at this stuff. Okay, so 8 things there that I see in these two passages, you put all together. These are the things that are God's design for government. Authority is from God, instituted by God. They're to punish evil. 4, reward good. Verse 3, not a terror to good conduct, but a terror to bad conduct. Verse 4, the government is God's servant. Verse 4, government bears the sword. Anybody want to take a stab at what that one means? Pun intended, by the way. Sword, stab. Okay.
Just consequences.
Consequences, but severe consequences, right? Doesn't say bears prison. I mean, that's part of it. But bears the sword, literally has the ability to take life if necessary. And look, you say, well, I don't know how I feel about capital punishment. Certainly God agreed with capital punishment in the Old Testament. And so this idea here of bearing the sword, this is a sword borne by the government in order to keep order and to discourage chaos in a society. Yeah.
How would you, if there wasn't that,
Yeah.
how would you fear?
Correct.
authorities?
Well, let's just say in an exemplary sense, Mark, look at the way criminals behave today because they recognize the lack of severe punishment that will come from the government. Okay, I want to talk about that in a minute. But there is no fear on the part of those who do evil now for this reason. For this reason. Okay. All right, here's what I want to do then. I put in there point 2, the state of the union and the state of the world. All right. And the only reason why I put that is because I knew that in going through that list, those 8 points, you can divide those up however you want, but you go through that list and you start to really think about those and you start to compare those to our government here in this country and the governments of our world today, you start to recognize some real discrepancies. There's some things that do not line up at all. All right. And so all I thought we would do is just go through the list one by one and let you guys interact with these some and just sort of make sure we all sort of have an assessment and you can kind of compare the two, talk about those things. But what I want to make sure we do is let's keep the comparison just that comparison, because then for point 3, I will talk about how we deal with some of these things. Okay? I don't want to do that just yet. All right? All right, so number 1, all authority is from God. All right? That's a hard one to take when your government is praising evil. That's a hard one to accept. And then you look at the next one, it's instituted by God. So not only is that government instituted and made by God and placed by God, but they're also given authority by God. Okay? Those are difficult to take, and I'm not going to suggest anything that's going to make it a ton easier, but what I will say is that we should remember that often when you look at what verse 3 says, what verse 4 says at the very end, carrying out God's wrath. There are multiple ways in which a government can bring God's wrath upon a people. And what I mean by that is consider something like Romans 1, where you see the downward spiral and degradation of a society through sexual perversion, let's say. Well, one of the ways governments can bring God's wrath is to allow people to be given over to those sins. Think about it this way. God's mercy on those people would be to to bring conviction of the sin that they're practicing or giving approval of, as Romans 1 says. God's mercy would be to stop it and to end it. And one of the ways that he pours about his wrath and punishes them is by allowing them to get worse and worse and worse. And think about our country today. One of the ways that happens is now you have a government who isn't saying, well, we don't know, we're not going to take a stand on this. Government's saying, no, you got to celebrate this. And if you don't, we're going to punish you. So in that sense, understand how is the authority from God and the institution of God doing what it's supposed to do? Well, God's turning them over to the lustfulness of their hearts and the depravity of their hearts. And we often think of God's wrath. We're going to talk about this next week. We're going to talk on Good Friday. We often think of God's wrath as severe punishment coming. And that's true. But another form of it is simply God giving people over to a depraved mind and a depraved heart. And going from bad to worse, the Bible says. Okay? All right. Let's talk about 3, 4, and 5, which is to punish evil, reward good, and be a terror to bad conduct and not a terror to good conduct. I actually think this one, maybe more than any other, ought to be a measure for us of where our government is, or the government in our country and governments of other countries. This is a really, really important defining measure of a government. Okay? Does a government punish that which God has defined as evil? And does a government reward that which is good? Is a government a terror to good conduct, or is a government a terror to bad conduct? I think as believers, this test ought to be one of the clearest and utmost that we use in evaluating our government and how they function. And here's the thing about this. I know evangelical Christians get accused a lot of politicking and Christian nationalism and things like that. But we should always be actively seeking for our government to reward that which is good and punish that which is evil. And look, every 4 years we have an opportunity to vote for things like that. every 2 years, I don't even know how the voting cycle works, to be perfectly honest with you. You get to vote a lot on things like this. And one of the ways that we can actively pursue a government that punishes evil and rewards good is with our vote. And we can do that with our voice, and we can do that by speaking out for things that we need to speak out for and against. That's a good thing. But we also can participate in our government. And so this is a very, very important one. And let me just give you a very practical way that this becomes apparent in our world. There are a lot of evangelical leaders with large platforms and big voices that want to tell you that it's okay to vote for politicians that are actively pursuing the opposite of rewarding good and punishing evil. That, to me, ought to be the first place where we say, wait a second. You are actively pursuing that which is opposed to what God has said is good for our government. Okay? And so this, to me, is a very, very important one, what I called 3, 4, and 5 here. Okay? Anybody want to say anything about any of that before I go on?
Could you give an example of what you just said?
Yeah. A specific example?
Or a general example?
Yeah, sure.
Either way we do it.
There is a rather well-known pastor on the Gospel Coalition 2 years ago saying that it's perfectly acceptable to vote for Joe Biden, regardless, and this is in the article, regardless of his stance on abortion. That there are more important issues than that. Now, you might agree that there's other issues that are important. I'm not disagreeing with that. You might not be able to vote for anybody, conscience-wise. But for a Christian pastor to advocate for somebody who is going to actively vote, I mean, look, you look at the policies that Joe Biden has put forth in just, 13, 14 months. It's atrocious, right? For a Christian pastor to advocate for that is to literally advocate against, for the very opposite of what these two texts are saying in harmony together. That's my example of that. And I'll just say that's the example that came to mind, but there was 2 or 3 others that came to mind instantly. I could have brought up other names like that, where people with big names employed by decent seminaries literally advocating for the opposite of what's described here. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah,
Okay.
but more of it as a vote against someone.
Well,
I mean, that's how it was couched, right?
yeah, that's
How can I
true.
vote
His
for
was
a guy-
couched very
how
much
can
against.
I vote for a guy that lives like this?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah, and look, I think there's very, very good and reasonable arguments to be made that somebody's conscience would not allow them to vote for either candidate, right? I could totally get on board with that.
No, don't get me wrong. I was so frustrated when Piper did that.
Yeah,
And I know, and I'm like, we ought to know it.
Yeah, we should.
You know, I know he changed minds. I know he did.
in fact, you
Because
did.
we have some family members that, that kind of took them off the hook.
Yeah, that's right. It just let them off the hook. That's right. That's right. So that was actually not the article that I was thinking of. That was at Desiring God, where he wrote that. Tabiti is the one that wrote the one at TGC. Karen Swallow Pryor is a big voice. She works for Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, employed by the SBC, hugely outspoken in this regard. Many, many voices like that. Jackie Hill Perry, very, very many voices like this, speaking out in the exact way that I just spoke of. And look, I don't want to make, what's that? A lot of them.
Yeah.
A lot of them. Most of them employed by the big parachurch ministries, quite frankly. And look, again, I want to make it clear, this is not necessarily a political thing. This is about a moral judgment coming from what government is designed to do, and it's literally saying what it's designed to do. Peter and Paul is saying what it's supposed to do, and a platform and a party saying we're going to do the opposite of that, and these people saying, but it's okay to vote for that. That in my mind, that is not political at all. That is a moral directive from God through His Word about what we are allowed to participate in or not. I don't say that's political. It has political implications, I understand, but it's not a political statement. Okay. All right, anything else? I'm always careful to bring up names, but I don't mind it either. I don't want to just throw them out there haphazardly. What'd you say?
I said you just like it better when he.
It's much better when Scott brings up the names and then. It's funny though, you were thinking of a different article than I was.
Yeah.
I totally, the Piper one was in my mind, but I was thinking of the other one at TGC. Oh, you're absolutely right. What were you gonna say?
So, the admonishment was to not vote for this person. So, so is that differentiated from saying you should vote for this person?
Well, here's the thing. With Tabiti's article at TGC, he was actively advocating for a vote for Biden and advocating against Trump. Piper's article was along the lines of, you can in good Christian conscience vote for either. That was and they're a little different. They're subtly different, but they're different. Go
I
ahead.
just find it would be very difficult for any pastor or whatever to advocate for a positive vote for someone when we know what the character of the candidates were.
That's true, although I'll just say this from my own standpoint. When Trump ran against Hillary, I wanted to vomit no matter who I voted for.
I
Okay?
understand that.
After 4 years of Trump in office, I could very easily say the man is a wretch, and he fakes a Christianity because he has all these fake, nasty, false teachers as part of his spiritual advisement panel, right? But policy-wise, he did more in 4 years to advance the cause of religious freedom and to protect children in the womb and things like that than any president in the last 30 years. So my point as a pastor, I could very easily say to somebody, you can in conscience vote for this man, but you better understand you're voting for a depraved wretch. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, so in other words, it's just an offensive or a defensive thing.
A little bit.
A vote do not vote for this person is saying one thing. Vote for this person is saying something totally different.
Yeah, that's
You'll
probably
find a
true.
difficult time finding any candidate out there that you could make that statement and not see a terrible deference
Yeah,
to.
no question, Greg. That's true. Although the one thing that Mueller brings up, and Mueller's the absolute man at explaining this, you're not voting for the man in this case. You're voting for the policies the man represents. I think that's helpful to differentiate in a constitutional republic as opposed to, say, an emperor of Rome, which they didn't get a vote for anyway. But Mueller's explanation of the differentiation between the man himself and the policies for which he will then put forth into government are different, and you're voting really for one and not the other. I mean, that's the thing, right? Was there any moral difference from a personal standpoint from Joe Biden to Donald Trump? Not really. Not really at all, right? So why would one be okay to vote for and not the other? Because you're voting for a policy platform as opposed to a person. Okay.
I was just recognizing, when God set up the tabernacle and he had Aaron working there, he's using a human man that's a sinner
Yeah,
to accomplish something, to be a holy priest.
yeah,
And so in the church, he uses men that are sinners
Yeah.
to serve in places
That's
of
right.
power, whatever you want to call it. And so the same thing in the government. He's just using sinful men.
yeah,
It's not really the right way to say it, but that's all he has to work with.
yeah, that's right.
Sinners.
That's true. No, that is the right way to say it, Tom.
That's all he has
Yeah.
to work with.
Yeah, you're absolutely
And so
right.
that's all we had to choose from. And,
Just gotta pick the best sinner.
You're not electing a Christ, and you're not electing an elder in the church either, right? What you're going to get is what you're going to get. It's different than any other situation.
yeah, so you can't expect, especially if you know they're not believers, you can't expect good things out of them. There is no good in man. So if you take a sinful man and put him in a place of power, you can't expect him to do good things.
They're going to be immoral in some sense.
Yeah, according to God's word, he's been put there by God
That's
to
right.
do the right thing.
That's right.
And because he's a fallen sinner, he's not going to.
That's the answer to that question, and that's the way Mueller frames it: is you have to elect the person who's going to align mostly with punishing evil and rewarding good, because that is what God commands. It's not really a personal thing in our form of government.
Doesn't say you're off the hook if they're immoral.
It doesn't say that, right?
I mean,
Right.
right.
I think what you're saying here is that
Well, this will be fun. You're gonna
thinking
what you
about
think I think, what you think I'm thinking.
we should be thinking through these 8
Well, that's why I wanted to do this, right?
As opposed to what gets thrown at us in the media, which historically has been, you know, whoever the media likes or who's good looking
Or which
well,
channel you
or
watch.
whatever.
Or which
Yeah.
channel you watch.
Yeah. But that's a big distinction because now a lot of people are thinking about that.
Right, exactly. That's why an exercise like this is super important to me. It really has nothing to do with likability or anything else. It has to do with what are the moral commands of God and what is the commands of God in the design for government and instituting government. Government is to punish evil, reward good, be a terror to those who do bad, and to be a rewarder to those who do good. Period. All right, let's. I want to give you guys some things here on the what we're to do. All right, I want to make sure this is clear now. Okay, this part is really, really important. 1 Peter 2, verse 15. The very first thing we can do in response to all of this is to recognize that all of this, including our part in it, is, as Peter says, for this is the will of God. This is the will of God, that by doing good, you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. He says that right in the midst of submitting to human authorities. You do good and put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. All right, so that is the very first thing we are to do here. When it comes to governments, when it comes to human authorities, human institutions, the will of God for us is that we would do good. Now, let's just do it now, all right? Point number 3 that I had, but I'm going to say it now, is we have to know what is good. That's not some moving goalpost thing. That's not some random thing. What is good is designed and defined by God himself. And we understand it through his word. So, if we just use the biggest issue of our day, all life is precious. All life is made in the image of God. All life is given by God and taken by God. It is up to him. He counts the number of hairs on our head, the breaths that we will take, the days that were given to us, numbered by him before there ever was one. God is the definer of life, and he gives it value and meaning. We don't get to do that. So therefore, when it comes to the issue of human abortion, there is one definition of what's good. Period. So as believers, we have to know what is good. I want to be careful about this. You should be able to, in some sense, say what I just said. You may not get all those parts. Maybe you have better parts than what I just said. But you should be able to define what is good. You shouldn't. Just say, well, abortion's wrong. You should be able to explain why. You should be able to know what is good and why. Why is murder in the womb evil? How does God give value to life? All those things. So if we're going to know what the will of God is and do good so that we silence the ignorance of foolish people, church, we have to know what is good. We have to know what God's word says. All right. Secondly, thirdly, however you want to look at it. I want you to see that both Peter and Paul say to us very specifically, be subject to. And that word is the same word that both of these men use in different places. That is literally be submissive to. Be submissive to. All right, now I know I'm going to create a conflict in your mind, and that's okay. I actually kind of want to do that for a second. All right. Look at what it says. So verse 1 of Romans 13, be submissive to or subject to the governor authorities. Right? He explains why, because they're from God. Verse 2, he says, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed. And those who resist, you're going to incur judgment. Now, that is that's hard to take, and then you add to it that both of them, as they wrap up their respective parts here, verse 17 of 1 Peter 2, honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. Romans 13, verse 7, pay taxes, revenue, respect, honor to whom honor is owed. So both men, in writing it separate I shouldn't say separate times, I'm going to explain this in just a second. Writing in separate places about similar issues say, submit to the governments and honor those in authority. All right? Now, I know the difficult part of this. I know the difficult part of this is that you hear those things and you say, well, how can I? How can I when you've already defined what government is and our government doesn't do that? Yes? Is that the question? Or are you just waking up? Okay. I saw his head going up and down. I thought he was agreeing with me. He was actually waking up.
You could also deduce from that, that if you feel that you can't submit to the government because of a biblical principle, that you should expect to be punished because you're not submitting to them.
Right,
Because God put them in place to do that.
right.
But
Which isn't a wrong equation.
Like, you look at Peter and Paul's history, like, they both spent time in prison.
Correct.
Because the government said, stop preaching the good news of Jesus Christ.
Correct.
And they said, no.
Correct.
We're gonna do it. And they went to jail. They
That's
didn't
right.
go there, killing cops. and
Not
stuff.
just to jail.
Yeah, to prison, to be tortured.
They went to their graves
Oh, yeah, they went all the way. yeah,
by the
they went all
governments,
way.
at the hands of the governments.
And,
So, yeah.
I'm sorry.
No,
And they probably weren't surprised that they got that.
They weren't at all.
They figured they would get it.
That's exactly right. This is why it's so important to know the role of government, to know what is good and what is evil, and then to know the commands that these men gave. Now, here's what this is a little history lesson for you. I'll do this quickly, okay? It's likely that both men wrote somewhere around 55 to 58 AD. Very interesting, actually. That I didn't know this really until I started looking at it. I never really compared this. The book of Romans and the book of 1 Peter were written right about the same time, within a couple of years of each other, probably. Okay? From different places. Peter is probably in Rome, and Paul is probably in Corinth, writing to the Romans. Isn't that funny? Okay? And they're writing right about the same time, under the same emperor. Okay? I think this is really important. All right, here's the history. Probably the worst emperor of the first century was a man named Caligula. They all had a bunch of long names, okay, but Caligula. He only reigned for 4 years, and ultimately his own government killed him. His own officers killed him because he had become so evil. And Caligula, in a matter of 4 years, probably killed more people than any other emperor in the first century. Now, there were some bad ones after him, don't get me wrong. Domitian and Diocletian, some of those other ones were really bad, but they were like in the 100s, okay, second
weren't
century.
Christians thinking that he was the Antichrist? Because
They literally called Caligula the Antichrist.
he was like burning them.
They did. And if you think about the timing of that, Jesus has resurrected and ascended probably 10 years or so, maybe 5 or 6 years prior to Caligula's reign. Okay? And within 5 years of the church starting, some of the worst persecution of the first century starts. All right? And it was pretty short. It was a flash in the pan in a historical sense, but it would have been a shock to this early church. So much so that the early church thought Caligula might have been the Antichrist that the early church referred to. Okay? However, the man who succeeded Caligula, his name was Claudius. They actually reigned together for a few years. It was kind of a weird situation. Okay? Claudius actually forbid anybody from proselytizing, which means in the Roman Empire, you couldn't share Christ without fear of death. And this is so weird. Josephus writes that Claudius kicked all the Jews out of Rome. But actually, if you read down and you read sort of the secular historians, he didn't kick the Jews out. He kicked the converted Jews out. The converted Jews, the ones who were following Christ, were trying to share Christ in Rome, and he kicked them all out. And he probably kicked all the Jews out along with them because he kind of put them all in one category. All right? So Claudius, he doesn't necessarily kill that many Christians, although he imprisons a bunch of them. And he expels all the Jews out of Rome, and he makes proselytizing illegal. So you can imagine the early church and what they're suffering under. In 54, which is probably just a couple of years before these books are written, Nero takes power. Now, here's a weird thing. This is an interesting part of history. We all know Nero because of the last few years of his life, when he became a tyrannical, like literally he went out of his mind. Do you know how Nero died? Killed himself. Because they were going to kill him, but that part's sort of inconsequential. But he literally went out of his mind, knew they were going to kill him, and so he killed himself. Okay? But in the early years of Nero's reign, he actually brought more peace to the Roman Empire probably than any of the emperors combined. He was sort of a recluse and all these things. But by 61, just after these books were written, that became what they call it, like the 38 months or something like that, where he killed more people in 38 months than anybody else had done just in that short period of time. Remember, he ended up killing his wife so that he could marry this other woman that was the senator's wife, and then it was a long story, but he ends up with like 3 or 4 wives, all this whole mess, right? Somewhere in the middle of all of that history that I just described is when these men write these things. So you sit here today and you're saying to yourself, well, I don't think I could submit to a government who doesn't punish evil and doesn't reward good. And I'm saying to you, the apostles said to. They literally said to, and it was way worse for them than it is for you. I can assure you of that. You can trust me on that. It was way worse for them. Here's the thing, and you said it very well. We have a very, very hard time as believers dealing in paradox. And the paradox of this is, government is designed a certain way, but it doesn't function that way, yet we're still told to submit to the governments. And how we put all that together, our consciences literally get torn apart. And we are like, okay, it's got to be one or the other. And look, this is the wild part of this. In the last 2 years, you have seen believers deal with this issue at a monumental level. You know why? Because every believer that I know knows we're supposed to gather with the saints on the Lord's Day. Yet every believer is like, but the government's saying I shouldn't. What should I do? Do I listen to the government? Because it says that I'm supposed to submit to the government? Or do I listen to God? God says submit to the government. Everybody's consciences are pulled apart in these issues. And look, I think we should be gracious to one another and recognize that these are very, very heavy issues for us. But church, this is why understanding what government is for, and what is good and what is evil, and how those things are different, and what government's role is, and what the church's role is, and all these things, why all that matters, is so that when you reach the point where the government says, do this which God has commanded otherwise, you say, well, like Peter and John before us, you say, that's fine if you want to say that, but when we leave here, just so you know, we're going to go preach Christ. You can tell us, government, what to do or not to do, but just so you know, God has commanded otherwise. I'm going to do what God says, not what you say. I'll honor you. I'll submit to you. I'll respect you. I'll pay my taxes. But at the end of the day, I'm going to do what God says.
You're talking about Acts 5, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so, but they did submit to the authority that the government had to punish them.
They did. They got beaten.
Right.
And then they went outside and preached Christ.
Yeah.
Literally, like outside. So, the point in all that to say is that it's important to know what good is. It's important to know what the will of God is, that we're going to do good. It's important to recognize what honor and respect and all of those things look like in this. And it's also important to recognize that our consciences are going to be torn in some of these things. But that's why it's important to know what God has said about all of it. Okay? All right, I know we're over time. Anybody got any questions, thoughts real quick before we wrap up?
One of my thoughts was in regards to that conflict that people are having. You know, the government, or at least what we hear from them and what we see on TV, is so in your face, and you're constantly being told what's expected of you and what you're supposed to do, and you've got the whole group going a direction, and you're expected to be in that group. And that the church doesn't do it that way. So if you've got a vast majority of people who aren't clear on God's rules, you know, that the way that conflict plays out in their mind is different. Whereas, like with Paul, if he's very clear on God's rules, he can still say, yes, submit the government, because he sees how they work together perfectly and how he knows what he's supposed to do.
Right.
And he doesn't have a conflict in his
Right,
in his mind.
exactly.
He's not confused about what's going on.
It wasn't nearly as conflictual for them, even under the most tyrannical governments we can imagine, because they had already worked out all the theology of this stuff.
So starting with that, and then all the other stuff makes sense.
You know, this is part of the reason why I said a minute ago that I think the government is an idol and viewed as a great power to some people. And those two things go hand in hand. Because when the government says jump and the Bible says sit, and people are like, well, wait. But in the apostles' mind, what God has said to do is what God has said to do. And if the government says to do opposite, that's just the government being their corrupt selves. We're going to do what God has said to do, including submit to them where possible. It's very important. You know, we talked about it 2 weeks ago. Seems like forever ago now to me, but Paul says to pray for people in high positions, kings and rulers and all those people. Why? So that we can live quiet and peaceable lives. Very, very important part of this whole thing. Okay? Any last thoughts? Thanks everybody for sticking around and hanging in there. All right, let me pray for us. Thanks, Father, for this time together tonight, and thanks for a chance to study your word together. Father, I give you thanks in this moment for both the example, but then also the writing of Peter and of Paul, and Father, how important these words are for us today as we understand the governments of our world, and especially the government of our country. And Father, I pray that for this group here in this place, and I pray for our church here, West Chicago Bible Church, Father, that we would be faithful to your word, that we would seek it out with diligence to know it and to live it out. But Father, I pray also that we would do so with quiet and peaceable hearts and spirits about us. Father, that while we may we may have to submit to your word and to go against what our government says, but that we would do so in humility and, Father, with consciences that are clear before you. And so bless us in our knowledge of these things and our understanding of them and our application of them in the days, weeks, months, and years to come. Bless us as we go from this place tonight. Be with us all, we ask. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.